Hey, hi everyone. So for this video, let's discuss about the variables, and the levels of measurements. So let's imagine this scenario. So let's say we have a new vaccine, and then we want to, let's say, compare this new vaccine with the existing vaccine, and we want to figure out, or we want to assess the effectiveness of the new vaccine versus the existing vaccine. So how can we compare these two vaccines? So before we could compare these two vaccines, uh, we have to collect the data incorporated with that scenario. So with regards to the data, it could be something of how many of the person with that has taken the new vaccine that had an ICU visit. Now comparing that to the existing vaccine, that or how many of the existing vaccine patients have been in the ICU visit. So meaning we can compare the percentages, no, to have some assessment on how effective the vaccine is. No? So there is some correlation attributed to the new vaccine effectiveness versus the existing vaccine. So the data that we will utilize to assess this effectiveness will be crucial. Without the data, we could not assess or evaluate the, the effectiveness of these two comparison. So let's talk about the variable. No? So a variable is the name of the characteristic that takes on the different values for the different units in a sample. So you can imagine at that scenario, the variable there is the percentage at which how many people has seen an ICU visit versus the total number of patients. And also variability is something that we assign to some characteristic that represents that thing, no? And one example of that, no, in engineering, we have the temperature. It could vary, no, varying degrees, and then the mass, we have a varying weight, no, in some sense, no. And comparing this to data, so data are the information, facts, or figures which can be subject of that's statistical analysis, and it refers to the set of values a variable has. So let's say you have a variable. If we collect the data, no, literally the data from the variable, then it became more specific. So variable here is a general attribute that we're trying to measure, and the data is that specific value of the variable. So let's say we want to find, or we want to measure the weight of the children in a class of 10 pupils. So the variable there is the weight, and then the specific measurements that we got will be the data. So we have a collection of data here, and there is also a variability in the data. So we have 31 kilograms, 28, 36, and so on. And we could analyze this data. Let's say we want to figure out what is the mean weight, or the average weight of the students, and so on. Okay, so breaking this down, the variables can be classified into the independent variables and the dependent variables. So the independent variables cause changes in another variable, while the dependent variables are the effects that are influenced by the independent variable. So in simple terms, the independent variables are independent. No? In itself, it is what causes the dependent variable to change. Okay? So the dependent variable depends on the independent variable. So the dependent variable is the effect. The independent variable is the cause. So one scenario here to analyze is that a researcher wants to measure the influence of different quantities of nutrient intake on the growth of an infant. So what is the independent variable here? So the independent variable here is the amount of nutrient intake, and the dependent variable is the growth of infant. No? So what affects the dependent variable? That is the amount of nutrient intake. So we could vary the amount of nutrient intake to see its effect on the growth of the infant, which could be measured in terms of, let's say, the height, the weight, or even other health indicators. Yeah, another scenario, suppose you want to study the factors that influence the success of online learning. So what is the independent variable here? So there are a lot of things to consider, no, that could influence, no, the success of online learning. So there are a lot of independent variables that we can consider here. So one example of that is student attendance, no, the internet quality, teacher effectiveness, no, and then students' prior knowledge. There are a lot of things. And then what we are measuring, or the effect that we are measuring, is the success. So the achievement test scores of the students, or the test scores in the exams, or even the board exams. Okay, and then for the scenario, again, no, a student wants to determine the optimal quantity of fertilizer to improve the yield. So the effect that we're trying to measure here, or the dependent variable, is the yield. And the independent variable here is the fertilizer quantity. So you can try putting a small amount of fertilizer, you could put a larger amount of fertilizer, and you will see the effect on the growth, no, or the yield of your crop. Okay. So another thing that or in some way we could also classify our variables into qualitative and quantitative variables. So for quantitative variables, no, so with the root word quantity, basically it's just a numerical variable, and the qualitative variable are measurements, no, or variables, sorry, that aren't numerical. So numerical, non-numerical. Okay, so the qualitative variables are also called the categorical variables. So an example of quantitative variable, so something that we could measure that has a quantity, that has a numerical value, which we know in engineering we have a lot of things to measure, which are the mass, volume, temperature, and so on. So anything that has a number attributed to that quantity, we have the quantitative variable. And then for the qualitative variables, so anything that we could classify the characteristic into, which could be nationality, gender, and so on. Okay, so let's move on to one other thing again about the data measurement. So there are different types of data that we are trying to collect, or in other words, the level of measurement. So with regards to qualitative data, we have two types of qualitative data that we could collect from our respondents, for example. So one of that is the nominal. So nominal, it is a qualitative qualitative data without order. Ordinal is a qualitative data with order. So these are non-numerical, non-numerical values. It could be with order or without order. So ordinal, nominal. And then for quantitative data, there are two things again, two things to classify. We have the interval and the ratio. So the difference between the two is that the interval has no true zero. There is no meaningful zero, and then the ratio has a meaningful zero. Okay, so let's have an example on measurements that we can classify them into nominal, ordinal, interval, or ratio. So for nominal, for the place of residence, is it nominal, ordinal, or interval, or ratio? So it is not numerical, so it could be either nominal or ordinal. But since the place of residence has no order into it, so therefore this is nominal. Okay, and then another given here. So how satisfied are you with the catering services? One, very satisfied. Very unsatisfied. Unsatisfied, neutral, satisfied, very satisfied. So this has in some sense a numerical value, but in reality, it is not actually a numerical value in some sense. We are classifying, so this should be a qualitative data, So we're classifying things, so this should be a qualitative data. So it could be nominal or ordinal. So since we have an order incorporated to this, 1 to very unsatisfied and 5 to very satisfied, then therefore this is ordinal. Okay, so don't be confused. No? If you have a number, it doesn't really necessarily mean that it is a quantitative variable. It could also be a qualitative as long as it is some classification. It could be an age group. No, one example of that is an age group. It could be ordinal also. No? So classify again. We have the time of the day. So we have time of the day as a number. We usually utilize numbers for telling the time of the day. So does it have a meaningful zero or not? So when we say 0 o'clock, no, it doesn't really actually mean empty, no, empty clock, no. So this is an interval. So it has no true meaning of 0. So it is an interval. And then last one, we have a blood pressure measured in millimeters of mercury. So this is so it has a meaningful 0. Pag 0 pressure, no, it has no, you have no blood pressure. Okay, so this is ratio. Okay, so to summarize, the dependent variable is the effect, and the independent variable is the cause. Nominal variables are categorical. No? Ordinal variable has ranks. Interval variable has no true 0 point. Ratio variable has true 0 point. Okay, thank you guys, and see you in class.